Welcome to the debate. For decades, the field of alternative dispute resolution has been locked in this paralyzing argument over mediator approach, debating whether a professional should be strictly evaluative or strictly facilitative. It's become the ultimate false binary.
And our source material argues that this dichotomy is, well, it's worse than just intellectually tiring. It's profoundly inaccurate. It just fails to capture the subtle, dynamic reality of what actually happens in the mediation room.
Precisely. The paradigm shift is to stop seeing evaluation as this one single directive technique, and instead view it as a broad, fluid continuum of techniques. We're talking about everything from, a simple nonverbal cue all the way up to a full-blown financial risk assessment. So this shift really forces a critical question. Does reframing mediator evaluation as a flexible continuum actually resolve the fundamental tension between achieving efficiency and settlement and upholding the core value of party self-determination?
That tension is the ethical crux of the field, really. My position is that while the existence of a continuum is, undeniable in practice, adopting it as the primary framework risks marginalizing foundational facilitative goals, like communication and relationship repair, and it ultimately compromises party autonomy, regardless of whether you're satisfying the technical rulebook. We have to prioritize ethical caution over, say, user expectation.
And I contend that the continuum framework isn't only practical and necessary, particularly for modern disputes rooted in complex litigation, but that its skilled use is entirely compatible with ethical standards. In fact, I go further. When it's used correctly, it enhances self-determination by ensuring decisions are fully informed and meet the explicit demands of users who are, bargaining in the shadow of the law.
That's a powerful framing, but, I come at it from a different way.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. Historically, the term evaluation has suffered from a widespread misconception. It's often been narrowly regarded as inherently directive or, coercive. In reality, the continuum covers a vast spectrum. It involves techniques ranging from subtle nonverbal communication, a moment of silence, a shift in gaze, all the way to more explicit analysis, like percentage assessments of legal risk or discussions of likely outcomes.
And that is precisely the difficulty.
But this flexible approach is often indispensable, especially in these complex litigation matters where parties and their counsel expect analysis framed by the legal landscape. The mediator's value proposition in those settings is really tied to their ability to help parties understand their situation clearly. This means helping them calculate their BATNA, their best alternative to a negotiated agreement, and, crucially, their WATNA, the worst alternative. We even see the use of MLATNA.
And for listeners who might be unfamiliar with that terminology, this is essentially the mediator helping to quantify the exact risks of walking away from the table and going to trial.
Exactly. So, skillful use of the continuum enhances informed decision-making by shining a light on hidden risks, identifying blind spots in the party's own legal analysis. And because of that, evaluation, when used proportionally and transparently, is entirely compatible with ethical mediation. It helps the party make a truly informed, self-determined choice.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that framework uncritically. Let me tell you why. While we agree mediators use a range of tools, accepting evaluation as this single fluid continuum, it risks blurring the crucial definitional distinction between controlling the process, which is the very essence of facilitative mediation, and influencing the content, which is the essence of evaluation.
But that content influence is exactly what parties in high-stakes legal disputes are paying for.
Well, the original models derived from community mediation in the 1980s after Frank Sanders' seminal multi-door courthouse proposal. They focused intently on communication, trust, and relationship preservation. In those contexts, community disputes, custody matters, restorative justice, purely facilitative skills like summarizing and reframing are paramount. The goal there is empowerment and understanding. Evaluation, by definition, introduces the mediator's content input, moving away from contexts where relationships matter or parties might be unrepresented. The risk here isn't just inefficiency, it's the subtle erosion of autonomy, which increases dramatically when efficiency becomes the primary commercial objective in litigation.
Okay, let's address the friction point head-on then, the ethical mandate versus practice reality. Much of the persistent debate, I would argue, is fueled by this widespread misconception that ethical standards somehow prohibit all forms of evaluation. But when you look closely at how major jurisdictions regulate mediators, that assumption just falls apart.
I agree that the standards permit some input.
They certainly do. I mean, ethical standards are clear. They prohibit coercion, and they prohibit stating a certain outcome with absolute certainty. However, the same standards often explicitly permit the mediator to discuss possible outcomes, analyze the merits of claims, point out strengths and weaknesses of positions, and actively help parties evaluate their options. This isn't a gray area. It confirms that appropriate, skillful evaluative techniques are allowed within the ethical framework. We're just clarifying what the rules already permit.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. If the misconception that evaluation is prohibited persists even among certified experienced mediators, it suggests there is a deep, unresolved tension between the desire for efficient settlement and the ethical mandate to maintain neutrality. I mean, mediators have an intuitive professional reluctance to cross that line. The rules emphasize prohibiting coercion and maintaining party autonomy precisely because those are the most vulnerable values in the room. The continued caution suggests that mediators should be extremely wary of how far they move along that continuum toward directive input, because the line between sharing risk and exerting undue influence is razor thin.
But this perceived ethical tension has to be balanced against user needs. The reality is that the shift in practice was natural. It was necessary. When mediation was adapted from those early community models to complex litigation and arbitration, where the parties are sophisticated and represented by counsel, the primary objective shifted. They shifted to efficiency, legal insight, and settlement. It just reflects user expectations.
A shift I view with some skepticism.
Facilitation, while it's valuable for relationship issues, may simply fail to provide the kind of structure and legal guidance that parties and counsel expect when they're, as we said, bargaining in the shadow of the law. Evaluation is the tool that delivers this expected value. It's a specialized service required for that specific commercial context.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, because it risks letting commercial demand define the ethical standard for the entire field. While efficiency is valuable in commercial contexts, focusing purely on what litigators want risks ignoring all the other crucial contexts where purely facilitative methods are best suited, like initial family disputes or preventative dispute resolution processes. The tension arose historically because training and ethical standards lagged behind the rapid adaptation to complex lawsuits.
But mediation isn't a monolith. Context is key.
Agreed, but by prioritizing evaluation based on user demand in the litigation context, we risk making relationship repair, mutual understanding, and process equity, the original intent of the movement, secondary goals across the board. The facilitative model is specifically designed to maximize mutual understanding and avoid any influence on content. We lose that critical protective measure if we simply normalize content influence as the standard offering across the continuum.
Let's move to the most difficult area then. The ethical impact of subtle evaluation on self-determination. I'd argue that many evaluative techniques, including a mediator's silence, a specific tone, or a gentle question like, "Do you have any concerns about how the jury might perceive that witness?" These things actually enhance decision-making by prompting the parties to engage in, well, more effortful analysis. This is crucial for sophisticated parties who may be suffering from overconfidence or blind spots in their own case assessment.
And that push for rigorous analysis is definitely a positive goal.
So defining evaluation as a continuum allows for this sophisticated, tailored intervention that's appropriate for the dynamic and stage of the mediation. The better question, as the source material suggests, is not whether the tool is permissible, but how and when to use the right tool to inform the party's choice without directing it. This ensures the agreement is voluntarily made with full knowledge of the consequences.
That's a compelling argument.
But have you considered the real-world ethical enforcement issue? If we define subtle techniques like a nonverbal expression of doubt, a raised eyebrow, a momentary pause, as legitimate evaluation, we make the boundary between ethical behavior and undue influence incredibly difficult to police.
Why is that different than a facilitative question designed to achieve the same end?
Because if a mediator uses a nonverbal cue to signal concern about the strength of an argument, they're explicitly projecting their professional assessment, their opinion, which influences the content of the party's analysis. This stands in sharp contrast to the purely facilitative approach, which avoids projecting the mediator's judgment entirely. It sticks solely to ensuring the party explores the consequences of their choices. We have to guard against the risk that the continuum model, by normalizing every intervention as legitimate, implicitly normalizes behaviors that subtly compromise a party's voluntary agreement, especially when the goal is a quick, efficient settlement.
I appreciate the vigilance toward autonomy. I do, but the core issue is that the dichotomy fails to reflect reality. By acknowledging evaluation as a skilled continuum, we move past a false and misleading intellectual deadlock that has, well, it's stalled professional development for decades.
That descriptive clarity is certainly a step forward.
The standards, when you read them accurately and apply them contextually, permit appropriate, skillful evaluation, which, when it's used proportionally and transparently, actually enhances party self-determination by ensuring those decisions are informed by a realistic analysis of litigation risk, their BATNA, their WATNA. The practical question for any commercial mediator is not evaluative or facilitative, but rather, what do these parties need right now to make the best, most informed decision, and how can the mediator skillfully provide that value while adhering to a mandate of informed autonomy?
And that is where we continue to diverge slightly. While sophistication and flexibility are indeed critical hallmarks of a skilled mediator, we have to constantly measure the use of any evaluative technique against the foundational values of neutrality and autonomy. The historical roots of mediation emphasize communication and trust, and while evaluation is appropriate in specific, highly represented litigation contexts, its inherent risk of directionality requires a fundamentally cautious approach. Understanding the continuum is essential for descriptive accuracy, yes, but recognizing that facilitation avoids the risk of undue influence suggests its continued importance as the ethical default, even as practice in litigation evolves, and the material provides much more to explore regarding the precise ethical impact of power dynamics in the room.